Good afternoon. So I'm James Graham. I'm with the Department of New Media. I've been asked to be a moderator here. I'm also an affiliate with the Apprentice Institute. Thank you very much. And so I'm going to moderate the talk for Dr. Rick Mueller here. So I just have a little bit to read right at the beginning there. So coming up for Prentice, Brown Bag Lectures, noon, March 29th, The Biological Toll of Racism on Health. So the presenter is going to be Cheryl Curry, Ph.D., Associate Professor of Health Sciences and Prentice Research Affiliate. And then the next one is going to be on April 5th. That's going to be at the Prentice Institute, is jointly sponsoring a talk along with the Women Scholars Speakers Series at the University of Lethbridge Faculty Association and the University of Lethbridge Faculty Association. So that's April 5th. There, 12 p.m., Markin Hall, and this room, 1090. So that's Women Academic Leaders, Some Challenges. So then I might just highlight a little bit of the information there. So this is Dr. Jane O'Day is going to be speaking on being a female in senior academic administration there, as well as our own Dr. Susan McDaniel, as well as Dr. Shelley Wismith, Dean of the School of Liberal Education. And that's coming up on the 29th there, so mark your calendars. There, okay, there is a sign-up sheet going around. Does anybody have the sign-up sheet? And it was here. Rick, did you pocket it? It is under here, so I have found it. So it is, there's a sign-up sheet there. This is for attendees that would like to be informed of upcoming talks. So please put your name on there if you're not already associated with us there. So the talk is going to be taped, but the question and answer period will not be taped. So basically the audience behind there, you're not in the picture, it's just us. So that's all you have to do, and you don't have to worry about your questions going out to the general population, but he does have to worry about what he says because that's the nature of the institution we work in. So there. So I'll just move on to Dr. Rick Mueller here. He is a professor of economics, academic director of the Lethbridge branch of the Prairie Regional Research Data Center, and associate director of the Educational Policy Research Initiative at the University of Ottawa. Dr. Mueller holds a BA honors and an MA from the University of Calgary and a Ph.D. from the University of Texas, Yeehaw, at Austin. He taught at the University of Maine before joining the University of Lethbridge in 2000, 1 year after me, and was seconded to Statistics Canada from 2009 to 2011. He is a Prentice Institute Research Affiliate. And the title of the talk today, as you probably know, is Impact of Literacy and Numeracy on Earnings. Do Immigration Admission Categories Matter? So I will pass you on to Dr. Richard Mueller.
Okay, thank you very much, James. Now that applause might be a little premature. I think you should hold that for a while. Anyway, thank you for showing up today. Very nice to see everybody here. This paper is co-authored with my co-author, Khuong Tuong. He's at the Department of Economics, McMaster University, and I'm happy to say he just successfully defended his Ph.D. dissertation a week ago today. So he's maybe Canada's newest Ph.D. at the moment. So, and this actually forms part of his thesis, this paper. So, anyway, so we'll talk about impacts of numeracy and illiteracy on earnings. Let's sort of give a little background for those of you who don't understand Canadian immigration policy. In Canada, we have sort of three broad classes of immigrants that are admitted to the country. First of all is the economic class. These are the people we kind of select based on what we hope to be observable attributes which will enhance their ability to succeed in the Canadian labor market and also help Canada as well. We don't want to basically take a lot of people and have to sort of support them for any sort of length of time. In the economic class, we pick people that are highly educated usually. We pick people that have perhaps been educated in Canada, have Canadian work experience. This is sort of the famous point system. If you're not familiar with it, you've probably heard about before. And so we admit these people based on their education, literacy, well, not literacy, but we do now. We do give them a literacy test. The economic class, their education, all those kind of wonderful things, and hopefully they'll succeed in the Canadian labor market. And that's about 60%. I'll show you some numbers in a second. 60, maybe a little low 60%. 60% or so of immigrants are admitted under this class, along with their what we call principal applicants, which are the people that are actually applying, plus their spouses and dependents. So about 60% of the economic class is principal applicants, so 60% of 60% is about 36% or so of people being admitted to Canada any one year are admitted based on these attributes, which are supposed to help them succeed in the Canadian labor market, and that's sort of what we're going to be talking about a lot today. Family reunification class is sort of the next largest class. You can sponsor your relatives, not too distant, but sort of near relatives, your parents or your brother or something like that, to come to Canada, for those purposes. So Canada is kind of unique in the sense that we do admit a lot of economic class immigrants. The United States is sort of the obverse of that. Family reunification seems to be their primary goal in immigration policy. And then finally, and I started talking to my students the other day about this, refugees. They're a pretty small class, maybe 10, 11% a year. Canada, I'll put up the numbers in a second here, but we sort of what's the word? Concentrate on refugees in Canada, right? Of course, they make sort of a big splash when they do come. The biggest wave to come recently, of course, were the Syrian refugees in 2015-16 in that area. And of course, this is anytime there's sort of criticisms of immigration policies, usually surrounding the refugees entering Canada. And those of you who've been around the planet a few times like I have will remember, of course, that back in the 70s and 80s, there was certainly a lot of debate about refugees and our generous refugee policy and perhaps being too generous and people kind of entering the back door that way. So certainly refugees are the most controversial, sometimes without good reason. Okay, so here's sort of just, what do they call it now? Government keep changing acronyms all the time. This used to be Citizenship and Immigration Canada. Now it's Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada. Anyway, these are their data. They only go back to, the most recent data I could find is 2015, just to give you sort of a broad idea of the numbers of people admitted under each of these classes. And as I just admitted, the blue line at the top is the economic class. Okay, so just a little bit north of 60% of immigrants are admitted in this class, and again, about 60% of those are the principal applicants, the ones that actually are, judged on the point system, given a certain number of points for their education, et cetera. And then the family class, and then refugees, again, down there about 10, 11% in the most recent data. And then this wonderful other class, which is not really defined that well, but it would include things like, the minister can basically sign a permanent residency application for humanitarian reasons. So let's say, I don't know, your parents live here or something like that, and you need to take care of them in their final days. The minister can sign something saying, okay, for humanitarian reasons, you're going to be allowed into Canada. And this is separate from the refugees. So just to give you some sort of idea, as I already mentioned, I sort of stole my own thunder there. 60% of admissions are economic class. Okay, where principal applicants, but not their spouses and dependents, are assessed under this point system, okay? So these are the people we're going to see a little bit later. We expect to do well in the Canadian labor market, right? Along the measures that I'm going to use. In 2010, so CIC at the time, now it's IRCC, introduced mandatory language testing for points-based immigrants. One of the sort of themes in the literature a lot about immigration is that immigrants look good on paper, and they may not perform as well in the Canadian economy as we kind of would like them to. And of course, we always compare immigrants to those born in Canada with sort of similar observable characteristics, as we say. So we sort of look at somebody, okay, same amount of education, same age, same this and that. How do they perform, controlling for all those things to somebody born in Canada? And usually, at least recently, immigrants don't perform as well in the Canadian economy on average. And of course, we're talking about means here, and there are plenty of exceptions, there's a distribution, but on average, they just don't tend to perform as well. And the reason is, the question in this paper and other papers is, well, why is that? Okay? And one of the reasons, of course, is language. Language is hugely important, right? Not only language, but numeracy skills, as we'll see, are important as well, okay? So we want to take a look at that a little more carefully, and maybe this is going to help to explain some of the divergence in incomes between the Canadian-born and immigrants who sort of look similar, at least on paper. And this is important too because our immigration targets are increasing, right? We basically try to have a stable immigration policy to, one of the rationales for immigration, of course, is to help the Canadian economy in general. Our population, as I tell my students, people are not having enough children these days, and so we have to replace our population somehow, and the way we do that, of course, is through immigration. And as the population grows, of course, in order to replace, the decline in natural decrease in population, we have to up the number of immigrants. And here are the targets now, about 330,000 this year, up that by 10,000 next year or so, and then another 10,000 in 2021. And that's up from about 272,000 in 2015. So we're kind of increasing the number of immigrants. So it becomes sort of increasingly important, I suppose, that we assess people coming into the country properly. Just sort of parenthetically, it always kind of, if you sort of look at immigrants and their satisfaction levels, they're very satisfied with being in Canada, okay? At least the research I've seen sort of been done on that. So a lot of times I think we might be measuring this the wrong way. This is what we're going to see the traditional way to measure immigrant success, at least in economic terms, is how do they do it in the labor market? How are their employment rates, wages, things like that. And I think that's a bad comparison sometimes. We do it, but I think it's a really bad one, because what we should be doing, of course, is comparing immigrants to what their situation was before they came to Canada. Okay, and they're, in essence, immigrants, like people, any other migrant, votes with their feet, and they're going to come here. If they're happier here than where they were, they're going to stay here. If they're not happy here, they're going to go back. But those levels of satisfaction do tend to be very high for immigrants. Okay, and so we don't really have a lot of sort of onward migration or reverse migration where people go back to their countries of origin. So what's the purpose of this research? Well, how do immigrants perform in basic literacy and numeracy tests compared to those born in Canada? Okay, that's sort of a big thing. And again, this is because literacy, as we're going to see, numeracy is even more important in the labor market. So these are kind of important things. Up until, I said, 2010, we still had the point system back then, and it's evolved over time. But we're sort of looking at people, with degrees or whatever, and saying, okay, degrees, okay, you speak English, supposedly, you say you do or whatever, and then we're going to let you into Canada. Now we started giving them a literacy test because we understand how important literacy is. And again, this literacy can be French, English, or both. Okay. And then the second bullet there, how are these test scores related to labor market outcomes? In our case, wages. That's sort of the common metric we use in economics to see how successful people are in the labor market. Okay. And the third point there, what other observable characteristics of immigrants are related to test scores and wages? So we'll see how that does. And how do these differ from the equivalent characteristics of the Canadian-born? We're going to see, one thing we see, of course, that foreign education is not valued very highly in Canada. And this has been a sort of a perennial problem we have, and I think any immigrant will tell you that they've had a hard time coming to Canada and basically having those foreign credentials, education in particular, recognized. And certainly IRCC now is going to great efforts to try to sort of come up with accurate assessments of these foreign credentials. We do that at the university here. As I'll talk to the admissions office, and they have little formula, some sort of algorithm they use to adjust GPAs for our graduate students before they're admitted when they come from a foreign country. And we don't know, individuals might have a hard time assessing the quality of different institutions around the world. And then, of course, are there differences between immigration and admission categories as well? All right, we want to sort of know all of that. So what is the existing literature? Well, it points to the importance of basic literacy and numeracy skills on earnings. Those things are important. Okay, and I'm going to be presenting this at if anybody involved in immigration knows about the Metropolis Project, right? It's a big deal. So it's going to be presented in Halifax next week. But when I was at the same conference in Calgary last year, Nahid Nenshi, the mayor of Calgary, kind of got up and gave a talk. And he was we're not just talking about sort of literacy skills, he started talking about something beyond literacy skills, because a standardized literacy test might test somebody sort of on the Queen's English, for lack of a better phrase. And yet language is so much more than just literacy too. And so I sort of found that really interesting. So you can imagine somebody coming to Canada right away and, landing, I don't know, wherever, and somebody starts speaking Canadian English to them, and they might go, well, geez, I never learned this kind of English. I'm gonna put on my go get a 2-4, and whatever the case may be, right? So it goes sort of beyond the kind of standard literacy test too, which I find is pretty interesting. But we can't, do anything about that here. So host country language proficiency is certainly determined by higher earnings, especially when French or English is the mother tongue. So immigrants that do come with those French or English skills already, that is their mother tongue, they might not speak sort of Canadian English, but it does give them a leg up on people whose mother tongue is not English or French. At least that's what the literature tells us right now. Certainly those who arrive under the point system do tend to have higher earnings than refugees and family class immigrants. And this advantage tends to be transmitted along to their children as well. Okay, so if you sort of come here, and we expect that to be the case, right? We admit these people on their observable skills, and we sort of expect them to do well in the Canadian labor market, and certainly they seem to do that way. Not as well as they used to, okay? And I'm not exactly sure why that's the case. I suspect it has something to do with sort of the changing nature of jobs in Canada. You know, you sort of think back to the 1950s when, you know, a lot of people in this room, their families probably came in the 1950s following the war, right? And, you know, what was needed in the Canadian economy at the time was a good work ethic and a strong back. Not necessarily language skills or numeracy skills or anything like that. Of course, the nature of jobs have changed recently, so those things are rewarded more highly in the Canadian labor market. And also, I mean, not surprising, young immigrants do tend to perform better than those, as do those who are educated or have labor market experience in Canada, especially the latter. Right, there's a whole class of economic immigrants now called Canadian Experience class, and we certainly see that at the university. A lot of foreign students coming here, international students coming. They can remain in Canada for a period of time, work, and then gain permanent residency status. So it's really the sort of labor market experience in Canada, which is really what influences success amongst sort of that group of individuals. So for the data nerds out there, what do we have? We have Canada's StatsCan, Survey of Adult Skills. Okay, which is part of the OECD's program for the International Assessment of Adult Competencies, otherwise known as PIAC, and this was a survey done in 2012. And these are fairly complex data, which is why you get some really, you know, hungry, good graduate student to work on the data for you, okay? And when you get to my age, and then you sort of interpret the results. So we have all the usual variables in these sort of data sets. You know, all the stuff about wages and education, all the sort of demographic information. But we also have sort of 3 test scores. And this is where the complexity comes in. I won't get into the complexity of these things. But we have literacy scores, okay? You know, it's sort of standard kind of literacy tests. And also numeracy scores, so people basically how well you can manipulate data. And this is all sort of done in a very sort of practical way, right? How can you manipulate data like, you know, or, you know, are you able to, you know, read simple statistics, or are you able to, you know, sort of function, balance a checkbook, that kind of sort of practical kind of skills that presumably would be worthwhile in the workforce. And then finally, we have problem solving in technology-rich environments as well. So this is a third score, which we're going to ignore. We've done another paper on this ladder score to see what kind of effects that would have in the labor market. But this is just, you know, can you very simple kind of computer skills, right? Can you use Outlook? Can you use Excel? Can you use, you know, a word processor? You know, can you turn on your computer, basically? Okay, very simple kind of stuff. Now, each of these has a range of 0 to 500, so that's sort of, if you know, that's the maximum score is 500. A global mean of 250, because these tests are given around the world, so this is the global mean of 250. The mean in Canada is above 250. Okay, and a standard deviation of about 50. Okay, we're going to standardize those test scores a little bit later on, as I'll explain. So we're going to include everybody in our sample age 25 to 65. We sort of do, a lot of times in labor market data, we limit the sample to 25 to 55 or so. Of course, the lower bound there, 25, is because before that, you know, good chance you're still in school being educated, right? We want to sort of get rid of that confounding influence. And then a lot of times those over 55. A lot of times, not so much anymore, but they used to be retired, right? Freedom 55. So we sort of got rid of those people as well. Of course, we got sort of fairly, you know, we're cutting the data pretty fine in a lot of ways here, so we expand the sample to include those up to age 65. We exclude the Indigenous population. Again, trying to sort of, you know, to sort of remove some confounding effects here, and also there's not very many of them in the PIAC. Those with missing information, and Canadians at birth born outside of Canada. Those also kind of confound the thing. If you're a Canadian citizen, if you're born abroad to Canadian parents, you automatically become a Canadian citizen, of course. Okay, and so we're just trying to remove those confounding influences. And again, there's not that many in the data anyway. As you can see, we have about 18,000 individuals, and about 4,000 of those fall into one of the immigrant categories below. So we'll talk about those in a second here. First, we're going to separate immigrants into young and adult immigrants. Of course, young immigrants tend to do better in Canada, largely because they're educated and sort of assimilated, I guess, for lack of a better word, in Canada. They understand the culture a lot more, et cetera. Okay, then let's say they're foreign parents. And again, I don't know if you remember when we sort of made the national news when our Syrian refugee family, one of them came to Canada, was highlighted on CBC, and they did like a 3-part series. Did everybody see that? Huh? Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. And of course, I think they, about a year after they arrived in Canada, they re-interviewed them or something. And of course, the kids were doing well. They're making friends and playing soccer and doing all picking up the language, whereas mom and dad were of course still struggling in their language classes. And that's not an unusual experience, definitely. So we do expect different outcomes, obviously, between adults and young people. And then we can divide the sample into 9 groups. Okay, we have all these adult immigrants here, which are the economic immigrants that arrive into the point system. So we have sort of 9 classes here, or 9 disaggregated categories. So in terms of adults, the economic immigrants, the refugees, family class, we have temporary residents in it. Those would be our temporary foreign workers, which is 2 different classes of people, which isn't worth getting into here. And then other, which is sort of the catch-all category for those that can't fit otherwhere else. And we talked to Stats Canada, they went, I don't know, they didn't know what it was, it's just other, so we don't take it that seriously because we don't really know what it is, it's not defined very well. And then we have young immigrants, those are the people that are 13 or younger when they come to Canada, okay? And sometimes in the literature it's called the 1.5 generation, right? They're not, as compared to the Canadian-born where we have second and third generation, okay? First generation, of course, is the people that come here directly. The second generation are people, as it says here, at least one foreign-born parent. Okay, so the 1.5 generation is kind of caught in between, in essence, because they're young. And then we have third generation, so if both your parents born in Canada, you're third generation. Okay? And so we delineate between these 9 categories a lot of times. So, in terms of results, I don't think nothing in the rule book says I have to speak forever, is there? In fact, I might gain some friends if I don't. Okay. So raw literacy and numeracy scores I'll talk about first, just to sort of look how these different immigrant groups compare, especially the Canadian-born, which of course is our comparator group here. And then we're going to use models for the correlates of numeracy and literacy in the first step. And then in the second step, we include these numeracy and literacy scores to see the impact on labor market wages. So that's our measure of sort of labor market success. What we can't show in here, what we can't show in here is self-employed, okay? And of course, self-employment is a big thing amongst a lot of immigrant groups, right? For whatever reason, they're not able to get jobs in the regular labor market, or maybe whatever the case may be, and so they're self-employed. We don't have wage data on those individuals, so we have to eliminate them from the sample. So, although not shown, I think this is kind of encouraging, this result. These skills do not have a differential effect for immigrants compared to those born in Canada. So if your literacy skills, regardless of whether you're an immigrant or Canadian-born, the returns in the labor market to those skills for numeracy and literacy are going to be identical, okay, at least statistically identical. So, I think that's kind of a good thing. Seems sort of promising. So here's the raw data. These are just literacy scores here. Again, if you recall what I said before, the range of these numbers is from 0 to 500, and this is all compared to third generation Canadian males, okay? And these are, if you sort of, refugees, they go down about 40 points compared to the third generation, okay? Which is almost 1 standard deviation below the mean. So that's sort of a fairly big drop, as you might expect. I mean, refugees, of course, they're not admitted based on these talents. They're not tested for literacy. And a lot of times, of course, they spend a lot of years in pretty crappy conditions before they come here, right? And they may never catch up. In fact, they probably won't ever catch up to the Canadian-born. The economic economic immigrants in general, in terms of raw scores, you expect, they look pretty close to third-generation Canadians, at least in the males here, as we might expect, okay, because they're admitted based on these skills, so you expect them to have higher literacy skills. Still not the same as, a little bit below, of course, third-generation Canadian, but still pretty close. Family, way down close to refugees there, as we see. I just put that in there for the sake of completeness, and then we have a bunch of temporary residents. And again, the temporary residents, it's a very heterogeneous category. You get people like temporary foreign workers, which we heard about a lot in Alberta, at least until recently. The temporary agricultural workers, you just go up to Pitcher Butte and hang out there for a while, you see plenty of them. And of course, these are people that come in for a short period of time, go back to largely Mexico these days, and then repeat the process again next year. But we also get a lot of intercompany transferees and things like that too, which are, so we don't really think of those. We think of temporary workers, at least I do. I mean, maybe I'm wrong. I know I'm wrong, but the first thing that comes to mind, of course, are maybe temporary agricultural workers, or the people that were staffing the Timmies up in Fort Mac or something like that we heard about in the news a lot. But that's not the case. There's a very heterogeneous group. We got a lot of very skilled people coming in as temporary residents, and that's kind of reflected in these data here. I mean, again, this is an average, right? So there's a lot of variation within there. And then second generation tend to do better than the third generation. Okay? Again, that's not statistically significant, I don't think. At least it won't be. So this is what males look like. Literacy scores. Females, kind of same thing. If you sort of hear males, females, pretty much the same kind of pattern I just described, as you might expect. Okay? Not so. The economic immigrants here don't do as well, I suppose, to females compared to the males. But again, that's because we don't know who is the principal applicant and who is the spouse or dependent. And it's more likely the males are going to be principal applicants. Okay? So that's probably explaining a little bit of that. But again, the second generation does fairly well. These are just the raw scores. We're not controlling for anything right now. And then we get something similar with numeracy. So again, the refugees way down. This is male numeracy scores compared to the third generation. Again, second gen does pretty well. Okay. The economic class does fairly well. We're going to see in a minute the reason the economic class does well on these test scores is because they are educated, right? Not because so. They do. These are just the raw data. We're not controlling for anything at the moment. Again, refugees don't do terribly well. Family reunification don't do terribly well, etc. Now these are important because so you look at refugees' family. It's almost one standard deviation below the mean. Okay, that's a big deficiency in numeracy language skills, and these are going to affect these individuals once they get in the labor market in our data. And then same thing for females here. So the patterns are very similar to numeracy, literacy, whatever. If we did the technology scores, they'd look pretty similar as well. So we basically see what we are basically, to summarize this part anyway, of course the refugees don't do terribly well. The economic class does reasonably well compared to those born in Canada. And the second generation does especially well. I kind of like I'm second gen, so as many of us are in this room, I suspect. So I always found that result kind of interesting. So let's move into the multivariate analysis. Of course, the raw stuff, that's fine, all good and well, but it's not too terribly interesting. And so we're going to have two models here. We're going to look at what determines test scores. What kind of factors do we observe are going to determine test scores? And then what kind of, how are these numeracy and literacy scores and all the other things that we normally look for, how is that going to affect wages? Okay? And in terms of the data, the test score coefficients are standard deviations from the comparator group. I'll explain that in just a second here. Wage coefficients are in log points. That's how we normally do things. Log points, which is roughly percentage differences. Okay, but just to be complete, I had to put that in there for the data people. Models contain level of education, if obtained abroad as well. So we know in our data if the highest level of education was obtained abroad or in Canada, which, as I mentioned before, is an important kind of determinant here of labor market success. Age and its polynomial, years in Canada, and urban and provincial indicators. So just the normal kind of demographic stuff. And then the wage models are also going to include test scores, okay? So I'm not going to write out the equations because I don't want to lose you guys for now, but we do that. Then we're going to look at the older and younger immigrants first and compare those to the Canadian born, and then we disaggregate the data into the 9 groups I just mentioned earlier, okay? Because we can't get much finer than that in these data, so 9 groups we're limited to. So if we want to take a look at test scores, again, these are literacy scores relative to Canadian-born, males on the left, females on the right, and then we have older and younger immigrants as well. So this is once we control for everything, okay? And again, on the vertical axis, those are standard deviations away from the mean, okay, or from the Canadian-born. So males, in terms of older immigrants, they score about 0.9 standard deviations below the mean for relative to those born in Canada, okay? If you're older immigrant. If you're younger immigrant, only about 0.7, okay? But it's still significant, obviously. I'll let you know when the things are statistically significant at all. And basically the same pattern for females, right? Lower scores for the older female immigrants, less of a problem for those females that came when they were age 13 or younger to Canada. So that's what literacy scores look like. And again, our numeracy scores fairly similar kind of pattern. Again, the young people then tend to be still have deficiencies when it comes to numeracy scores, but they're not quite as large as those people who come when they're older to Canada. Okay. Now we can break it down. Again, we have sort of there are 8 groups here. Everything here is compared to third generation. Canadians. And then, so in the far left-hand column there, the second generation, NS means not significant. So we don't have any significant differences between the second generation and third generation Canadians when it comes to these literacy scores for males anyway, okay? No statistical differences you sort of might expect. Adult refugees, again, about a 1.2 standard deviation difference between adult refugees and those third generation Canadians. So that's a huge difference, right? And we're going to see how this impacts wages in a minute, okay? Here's sort of the surprise here, adult economic immigrants, almost, about 0.75 standard deviations below the mean. What's really saving economic immigrants is the fact that they're so educated. So they have very high levels of education on average, way beyond the average of the Canadian born, and this is certainly what's helping them in the labor market, okay? So even so that, education is going to help them in the labor market. Of course, literacy scores are going to, work against them in the labor market, but the wages tend to, be a combination of those two things, of course, so they don't do as poorly as they would, as suggested by these data here. But they're still, their scores are lower. Family class, again, fairly low, blah, blah, blah. Adult temporary, young refugees, and young non-refugees. We can't make the data any finer than that. We'd like to be able to break out young refugees into all the classes you see for adults, but there's simply not the numbers to justify it. But on average, basically the pattern is similar. Young people they do better in terms of these scores on average than older immigrants of whatever flavor. Okay, same thing for females here in terms of literacy scores. Again, second generation not significant, so second, third generation pretty much the same statistically. Refugees tend to be at a bigger disadvantage compared to economic immigrants, etc. So the pattern is the same. At least I see the pattern the same. Same thing with numeracy scores for males. Sort of similar kind of idea here. The refugees tend to perform fairly poorly, but so did the family class in this case here, right? So the economic class does somewhat better. I think, and this would be an interesting, I suspect that numeracy skills probably translate better into Canada than literacy skills, I suspect, okay? And maybe that's why we don't see such a dip here. Anyway, again, young refugees, somewhat surprisingly, they don't perform very well at all. Young non-refugees tend to perform a little bit better on the far right hand there, at least in terms of males. And then females, not quite the same. The scale's the same in each of these cases, so they don't perform as poorly compared to their male counterparts on these numeracy scores, even though we control for everything, which is, we're still kind of unpacking these results a bit, I suppose, but there are differences by immigration admission category, obviously, in these test scores. So what else do we have that I didn't I'll just say this in English, I suppose. Education is positively related to literacy and numeracy scores. So a university degree or higher basically puts you 0.8 to 1 standard deviation above the mean. So, and that's compared to high school. So you get about 1 standard deviation above the mean, well, 0.8 to 1.0 standard deviations above the mean if you have a university education versus if you have just a high school diploma. Okay. Unfortunately, the second bullet there, the relationship is weakened if education is from abroad. So depending on what models we use, between 0 and minus 0.4 standard deviations in the case of a university degree or higher. So on one hand, in terms of immigrants, that high levels of education is helping them overcome literacy, right? A low literacy score in a way. But if that education was obtained abroad, that's a bigger deficiency still. So it's good that immigrants are coming with such high degrees of education, but it's still, foreign education is still harming the immigrant population, okay? As I say in the third bullet there, higher education rates among immigrants partially offsets these, okay? And the last point there is time spent in Canada, we control for that too, does little to improve test scores, about 0.01 standard deviations a year. So if you remember some of the stuff we just sort of showed, if you look at these standard deviations, close to 1 standard deviation, and if you only catch up by 0.01 standard deviation a year, it means you have to be in Canada for 100 years to catch up to the Canadian born. And it's just, obviously it's not going to happen, right? And again, these are averages, and there's lots of there's distributions here always. But, so in terms of wages, let's take a look at those now, because this is how numeracy and literacy sort of translate into labor market success. So if you look at the gray bars there, those are literacy scores, and these are the coefficients on in a model. So we're controlling for all the other things I talked about before. So literacy scores in gray, numeracy scores in yellow, older immigrants in blue, and then the younger immigrants in orange. Although I only understand primary colors, that might be something a little more detailed. But anyway, so what do we have? Males and females again. So on the left-hand side, males, on the right-hand side, females. So in terms of literacy scores, well, there's the effect is not significant. Okay. Once we control for numeracy, and this is what's interesting. Literacy doesn't matter once you control for numeracy in these numbers. So numeracy skills are much more important in the Canadian labor market than literacy skills. They're highly correlated. If you do a simple correlation coefficient between numeracy and literacy scores, it's about 0.85 or something like that. So it's a very high related, very highly correlated. But if you put them both into the regression together, it's the numeracy score that stands out, and those are significant. It basically renders the literacy score insignificant statistically. Older immigrants don't tend to do as well, of course. Younger immigrants do tend to do better relative to the older immigrant anyway. So, and in fact, if you look at the males there, it's not significant. So younger immigrants, we can't, again, partially because of sample size, but we can't statistically say they're different than the Canadian born in our data here. Okay, what's next? So again, we disaggregate the data, okay, for males in this case. So we have our different immigrant groups and second generation Canadians as well. And again, the literacy score shows up as being insignificant statistically. The numeracy score, again, is about 0.1. Okay, so what does that mean? 0.1 in log wages means about a 10 or 11% jump in wages for each standard deviation you're above the mean in terms of your numeracy score, right? So that's a pretty big jump. That's, I mean, you think about 10%, 10, 11% a year. If it compounds over your lifetime, that's a pretty big number. The second generation, not significantly different than the third generation, which is something we find out all the time. Here's refugees performing about 45, well, what is that, 40.48 or so, 47 log points. So that's a huge penalty in the labor market. But here's what's surprising too: the adult economic immigrants are still, about 0.32 or so log points below the third generation Canadians. Okay, so again, I mean, the fact that these people are coming with such high degrees of education is really helping them in the labor market, and the situation certainly would be a lot worse for these people. But you sort of ignore the adult temporary there. We don't really know what's sort of going on there. But certainly the adult economic, compared to the other major immigration groups, are doing fairly well. Okay, still not as well as the Canadian born. And in fact, there's whole literature out there that says that immigrants basically these days never catch up, okay, to the Canadian born. Again, on average, there are lots of exceptions. Okay, young refugees don't do too terribly well. Young non-refugees do somewhat better relative to third-generation Canadian males. And then similar thing for females here. So the economic immigrants do reasonably well, okay, compared to the other immigrant groups, but still not as well as third-generation Canadian. And again, it's still a numeracy score that seems to be important for these people in the labor market. So what do we have here? More things, education positive related to wages. So here again, this is where it's beneficial to immigrants here because they're so highly educated. I could put up some statistics, and the economic class is like twice as likely to have a university degree as the Canadian, somebody born in Canada. Okay, so a university degree is going to be related to higher wages, about 0.36 to 0.44 log points, which is about a percentage difference, roughly. Okay, but again, the relationship's going to be weakened if you get that education abroad. Okay. And again, people are still trying to disentangle those effects a lot of times. Is it because the foreign education is inferior to our education, or is it simply that employers are ignorant about the quality of foreign education, or more likely than not, some sort of combination of the two of them, right? And again, I guess we could probably disentangle these results a little bit more if we sort of looked at different countries, if we could figure out what the country where the education was obtained. Okay, but some of the literature out there says, of course, we do have a tendency to reward other English-speaking country, Western countries' education much higher than we do other countries in the world. So, and again, this is a bit of a problem, of course, if we're in fact misjudging the quality of that education and not rewarding people accordingly for it. This is detrimental to all of us. not just the immigrants themselves, of course, who are not using their talents properly. And so, as I just said, the relationship to weekend of education is from abroad. But again, higher education rates amongst immigrants partly offset these deficiencies in test scores. So, working sort of against each other. Then we do something a little really tacky called quantile regression. So we look at distribution, where in the distribution some of these problems are, okay? Or some of these problems, some of these effects are. And so you sort of think of this wonderful wage distribution. We can look at different points of that wage distribution. We look at the 25th, 50th, which is the median, and the 75th quantile, without getting too techie. Literacy and numeracy scores are important throughout the distribution. So we have individual rates of return of 8 to 13% in there, okay, for these scores. So if you're one standard deviation above the mean, you could make 8 to 13% more. Okay, so these are hugely important. University education increases in value as we move up the wage distribution, as you might imagine, right? Sort of think about, in this other project that I'm sort of involved in, we talk about sort of the myth of the barista graduating from university, right? They get their shiny new humanities degree. It's always the humanities, it seems, right? And they go in the labor market and they basically, I don't know, put little leaves on top of, cappuccinos or something as baristas. Well, if you sort of take a look at the data, usually humanities majors take a lot longer to get their foothold in the labor market, but they do okay eventually. They're not going to make as much as an engineer or something like that, but they do relatively well. And so this doesn't surprise me. So university education does increase in value as we move the wage distribution. If you're a barista with a degree, it's not going to be rewarded, obviously, because presumably, I could be wrong, and forgive me if I offend anybody, but I don't think being a barista is a highly skilled kind of occupation. I could be wrong. Although I've tried to put the little leaf on the top of the cappuccino myself without much success. So but anyway, so if you have a university education, that's not going to be rewarded at the lower tail of the distribution, because you might have these sort of entry-level jobs until you get your foothold in the labor market. Where the education becomes important, of course, is at the top end of the distribution, or towards the top end. It's going to be valued a lot more highly up there. Excuse me. But of course, we have wage penalty if this education was obtained abroad at the top end of the distribution too. The penalty is higher up the top end of the distribution, probably for the same reasons that I just sort of stated. Okay, and then again, the wage penalties for immigrants higher at the lower tail of the wage distribution. So just being an immigrant in itself, okay, you're going to have more problems at the bottom of the wage distribution. So we're still kind of unpacking some of those results as well. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is it depends on where you are on the wage distribution, what kind of impact your lack of skills, or your foreign education is going to have on your earnings. So here's the takeaway messages, what you've all been waiting for patiently. Thank you very much. Age and immigration matters. It's hugely important, right? There's something in the literature called the Kissinger effect. Have you ever heard of that? No?
Nope.
Everybody knows who. Except brain fart now. Henry Kissinger, thank you. And of course, you know his accent, extremely thick, right? Okay, very thick. He has a brother about 2 years younger than him. Okay, no accent. Okay, I think Henry came when he was 14. His brother was 12 when they immigrated to the U.S. Okay, and it resonates with me. My father came to Canada when he was 12, and his brothers were older. And so my father has very little accent, none in fact. He still has problems with the THs, but as Germans will. But other than that, no accent, whereas his brothers sort of do. Okay, so this is sort of the Kissinger effect. A lot of times is sort of uses this sort of thing about how people can kind of adapt, get those language skills, right, and assimilate into their new kind of environment. And that's why age and immigration matters. You sort of have that Kissinger effect, which could be detrimental to people if they come when they're older, and the older they are, the more problematic it could possibly be. Okay, so age and immigration matters both in terms of the test scores and in terms of labor market earnings. Okay, likely the result of being educated in Canada. There's all this sort of social stuff going in the background too. If you grow up in Canada, you're probably more likely to maybe know people, have those networks, the social supports, the cultural literacy, all those kind of things that are hugely important in adapting to a new location. All immigrant groups have lower literacy and numeracy test scores compared to those born in Canada. Okay, not surprising there. All immigrant groups also have lower labor market wages. And again, this is something where, back 20 years ago in the literature, you say, okay, we'd look at the data and the census data or something and say, okay, well, here's the trajectory. Immigrants come to Canada, they start low, okay, they gain those skills very quickly, and so their age earnings profile is much steeper than the Canadian born. And they catch up and in fact exceed Canadians. That doesn't seem to be happening anymore. And maybe this is one of the reasons it's literacy or numeracy scores. We have a lot of heterogeneity, so a lot of differences between immigrant groups. Economic immigrants have the highest test scores and wages. And this result, the last result we found kind of interesting. Numeracy tends to be rewarded more than literacy in the Canadian market. So tell your kids to pay attention to those math classes. Would be fairly important. Higher levels of education amongst immigrants offsets at least some of the negative effects of these lower test scores on wages. Okay, so on one hand, immigrants are underperforming because of literacy and numeracy scores. On the other hand, they're better performing because of this high rate of education, especially if that education is obtained here. And that's pretty normal in literature as well. And again, the results say nothing about self-employment. I think this is a huge limitation of this work right now, because so many immigrants do go into self-employment. We just simply can't observe their wages. StatsCan, and this is common in all the StatsCan data as far as I know, they don't collect wage data for self-employed people. Okay, they just simply, it's too difficult to do. Policy implications. Well, this is where it gets kind of testy. I've sort of thrown this out there. So can we reweight the point system to better reward youth and the Canadian educated? Can we differentiate between Canadian education and foreign education? And if you want to take that argument to its extreme, I suppose we could, have a number of points awarded for different educational institutions in different countries. That's maybe something very complex, obviously, something that might help immigrants when they arrive to Canada, but I think politically that'd be extremely unpalatable and it's unlikely to happen. Okay. Maybe more comprehensive literacy testing. And what I mean by that is beyond the economic immigrants, at least the principal applicants, who are the only ones tested right now. Okay, and in fact, it's ridiculous. When I was sort of researching this, I was looking at when they introduced the literacy testing in 2010. It was like everybody. Of course, you can't discriminate, presumably, right? And so they had like Harvard-trained lawyers who were coming to Calgary, to Canada after 15 years of experience, having to take the English literacy test. And these are, of course, going to be extremely literate people. But I think they had to sort of apply the policy, sort of a blanket kind of policy, right? You can't discriminate, and where do you draw the line if you do anyway? So maybe we could go beyond. There's a huge pool of people wanting to come to Canada every year under different classes. We already take care of the principal applicants in the economic class with literacy testing. Maybe we should broaden that, okay? And then maybe introduce numeracy testing as well. That seems to be more important, right? I mean, they are highly correlated, but in terms of the independent effect, it seems like numeracy is much more important than the Canadian labor market. What about enhanced training in Canada? Doesn't necessarily, we don't have to accept people, but maybe we should, for them to hit the ground running better, train them once they get here in terms of those skills that are so necessary and important in the Canadian labor market. We have a huge infrastructure for immigrants about literacy and to try to train them in French or English, but maybe we should include numeracy in there as well. I think that's it. Thank you. I just want to acknowledge the funder of this research. So thank you very much for your attention.